Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, it's an honor to be here, so thank you all very much for being here to share this time with me. And I would like to thank Catherine and the other organizers for inviting me and making it possible for me to be here. Now, the title of this talk is How to Live in the Anthropocene, and it's divided into 9 sections. And I think you'll find that many of the themes that I talk about will echo some of what you've heard earlier today, sometimes from a slightly different perspective, sometimes embroidered in different ways. So the first section is the introduction. Almost 20 years ago, in 1997, a distinguished group of scientists led by Peter Wituszek published an influential article in which they assessed the human impact on Earth. They calculated, the problem with reading this off of a computer screen, the computer goes wild. Yes, what have I done? Oh, sorry. Yes. They calculated, let's take this from the top. Okay, my computer is betraying me. Okay. Right. It's all right. I think so. Yes. All right, now back to Peter Wituszek. It is behaving very strangely. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Okay, you see, one thing I'm going to be talking about is technology, and so... all right, so they calculated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Earth's land surface had been transformed by human action, that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had increased by more than 30% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that more nitrogen had been fixed by humanity than all other terrestrial organisms combined, that more than half of all accessible surface fresh water was being appropriated by humanity, and that about 1/4 of Earth's bird species had been driven to extinction. Remember, this is nearly 20 years ago. They concluded that, quote, "It is clear that we live on a human-dominated planet." In recognition of the increasing human domination of the planet, some scientists, as you know, have proposed that we have entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. And as you also know, the term was first used by the ecologist Eugene Sturmer in the 1980s, but came to widespread public attention in a short article that he co-authored with Paul Crutzen in 2000. It's hard to believe that all of this about the Anthropocene has occurred in the last 15 years, even though we already had papers talking about human domination. And while the word Anthropocene is new, the idea has been around since at least the 19th century as scientists, theologians, and naturalists struggled to give voice to the dawning realization that humanity, with its sheer numbers and technological power, was remaking the planet. In 1864, the American polymath George Perkins Marsh identified human agency as responsible for large-scale changes in the planet. He was struck by the massive changes that he had witnessed from the time he was a child in Vermont living alongside Native Americans to the deforestation and desertification he witnessed as a diplomat working in the Mediterranean region. So I'm quoting Marsh now from his 1864 book. "There are parts of Asia Minor, of northern Africa, of Greece, and even of Alpine Europe, where the operation of causes set in action by man has brought the face of the earth to a desolation almost as complete as that of the moon. And though within that brief space of time, which we call the historical period, they are known to have been covered with luxuriant woods, verdant pastures, and fertile meadows." Now, the idea of the Anthropocene has fallen onto fertile soil, and again, as you know, a proposal to declare the Anthropocene a new epoch in Earth's history is under formal review. This takes us to section 2, the Anthropocene under suspicion. Some humanists and others have been suspicious of the concept of the Anthropocene. They see in the very name the glorification of the human domination of the planet. Now, they're not wrong to think that how we categorize can be relevant to what we think is permissible. Categorizing a plant as a weed, an animal as a pest, or a person as a thug has implications about how they may be permissibly treated. But sometimes a category is just a category. Think of triangles. You may treat a triangle as if it were a square, but that would only be wrong in the stupid sense of wrong, not in any richer normative sense. Geological categories are somewhere in between. The Holocene is not a logical notion in the way that a triangle is. The term was not invented until 1867, not proposed as an epoch until the Third International Geological Congress in 1885, and not formally adopted by the US Geological Survey until 1967. Despite the fact that this term was carried over into English from a French term that was constructed from Greek materials less than 150 years ago, it is not viewed with suspicion in the way that the term Anthropocene is. What accounts for the difference? Well, part of the explanation is surely that the historical classifications that we are born into typically form part of an unquestioned baseline. They are naturalized. When it comes to the Anthropocene, the sausage is being made before our very eyes. And as with actual sausage, it's not hard to think that there is something unseemly about the process. Another concern is the implicit reference to humanity that is contained in the term Anthropocene. Some seem to think that to name an epoch with a term that refers to humans is to glorify humanity and its domination of nature. But surely this does not follow. We can speak of the Dark Ages without glorifying darkness. Still, it is good to be aware of dangers that lurk around the categorization and vocabularies that attend them. Okay, section 3. We have always been Anthropocene. Another view is that the Anthropocene has been around as long as there have been people. There is nothing new about the Anthropocene. What is new is that people are waking up to it. Those who incline in this direction glory in saying there is no such thing as pristine nature or wilderness. They emphasize that people have always modified their environments, and they often delight in stories about environmentalists mistaking for wild nature landscapes that were transformed by earlier peoples. Like all historical actors, the central figures in the history of environmentalism worked in a context that is not our own. But they were not stupid, nor given to first-year logical blunders. The human impact on nature is a matter of scope and degree, and it is these factors that matter, not the supposed violation of some purity condition. What matters for the demarcation of the Anthropocene is that some region in time can usefully be spoken of as qualitatively different from some previous region. There can be vagueness between these periods, and the qualitative distinction can supervene on quantitative differences rather than resting on irreducible differences of kind. It is against this background that the Vitusic study is a good marker. A study like this done 1,000 years earlier would have produced radically different results. Yes, life has always affected the earth, but there is something new and different about the way humanity affects the planet today, and thereby itself. Whether or not this is of geological interest, it is of great cultural and moral moment. So this then takes us to section 4, what matters about the Anthropocene? Geologists write Earth's history on the basis of what is found in layers of the Earth's crust. What may be more difficult to find in the stratigraphic record are distinctive traces of the systematic human transformation of the lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and biosphere that have occurred as a result of industrialization and mass consumption. Yet, when it comes to understanding who we are, where we live, and our relations to others, this may be of greater importance than whatever traces are left behind in the Earth's crust. The most obvious feature of the Anthropocene is the growing human population and its demand for energy, food, goods, services, and information, along with the need to dispose of its waste products. At the beginning of the Holocene, there were probably about 6 million people living as hunter-gatherers. Today, there are more than 7 billion people, mostly living in urban societies, many with a command over resources that only the nobility would have had a few centuries ago. Technology is an important part of the story of the Anthropocene. The humanity that has transformed nature is now organized in highly complex systems bound together by air travel, oil and gas pipelines, electrical wires, highways, train tracks, fiber optic cables, and satellite connections. In 1907, Henri Bergson, a former professor at the Collège de France, wrote, perhaps in this very building, quote, "In thousands of years, our wars and revolutions will count for little, but the steam engine and the procession of inventions of every kind that accompanied it will perhaps be spoken of as we speak of the bronze or of the chipped stone of prehistoric times. It will serve to define an age." Technology is no longer something that we use. It is an integral part of who we are. Technology enables action at a distance that would once have seemed inconceivable, whether as a sexual encounter in virtual reality with someone on the other side of the world, or as the instantaneous transfer of wealth, resources, and power. The conjunction and effects of large population, high consumption, and technology has affected the nature of our relationships and our conception of agency. In some respects, we feel empowered. We can save a child in a faraway land by making a phone call and pledging a contribution. The swipe of a credit card can deliver goods and services from remote parts of the world. A few clicks at a computer allow us to register our opinions about everything from Iran's nuclear program to a woman who left her dog in a car with the windows rolled up in a parking lot in Kansas. A man in Las Vegas controlling an unmanned drone can stalk and kill a single individual on the other side of the world. Together, we can change climate, drive species to extinction, and acidify the ocean. Never have humans been so powerful, hence the name Anthropocene. Yet, at the heart of the Anthropocene is a widespread sense of the loss of agency. In the United States, we say money controls politics, as if elections are not ultimately decided on the basis of who gets the most votes. Many people in both developed and developing countries feel trapped in their classes and social roles. The main obstacle to taking action on climate change is the deep sense of its inevitability and our powerlessness to affect its course. The Anthropocene has also brought confusion. In a world in which everything affects everything else and no one feels decisive over much at all, the distinction between causation and complicity has become fraught. When I drive my car, am I causing climate change, contributing to it, or complicit in it? Or does it matter at all? For that matter, do these questions matter at all? The list of questions could go on, including the questions about questions, and on, which is part of why so many of us retreat to private life. But what is private life in the Anthropocene? Technology has brought with it increased transparency, which many of us would say is good, and a loss of privacy, which many of us would say is bad. I can read police reports from the jurisdiction of my choice, and I can find online the salaries of my colleagues who work in public universities. But should I investigate myself, I would be shocked by how much is readily available, and even more shocked by the strange character of the person I would discover. In the technology-driven world of the internet and social media, the distinction between intersubjective validity and just plain old repetition threatens to break down. What does this do to an outlook such as that of traditional liberalism, in which the public-private distinction is absolutely central? In a world of greater resources and fewer well-insulated spheres of life, everything becomes increasingly fungible, from wombs to kidneys to artworks to lives themselves. Trade-offs between the near and dear and the remote and strange become possible in a way they never were before. Sitting in his rooms in Cambridge in the 19th century, the philosopher Henry Sidgwick could read about famine in Bengal and talk about how we have duties that are not bound by space. But there was little he could do about it in real time except to decry it. I, on the other hand, can immediately empty my bank account and make something happen on the ground, for good or for ill. Or instead I could just go in for some online gambling on my children's future. Or I could just leave everything to my canary. Everything seems possible, but nothing seems to matter. This leads to a crisis in meaning. Life has traditionally been lived against the background of a nature that is seen as structuring, affecting, sometimes even determining, but always largely independent of human action. The book of Matthew tells us that the sun shines on the just and unjust alike. Once geoengineering is perfected, we may be able to fix this oversight of nature. But what then becomes of the message of humility and compassion that this teaching is meant to evoke? Together, we are remaking the planet, though no one seems to have actually decided that this was a good idea. Many of us feel as though we have choices over matters that were once fixed, what to have for dinner, yet feel powerless over things that we once had power over. So this brings us to section 5, the sea of agency. The feeling of powerlessness sometimes seems to emerge from the fact of too many agents of too many different kinds. We swim in a sea of agents operating at different levels of social organization, often with unclear causal powers and even less clear permissions and mandates. In this sea of agency, responsibilities are enmeshed across units and levels of social organization. The responsibilities of one agent or set of agents may only be activated by the fulfillment of responsibilities of other agents or set of agents, operating at yet other levels of social organization. There is often no clear way to decide which agents are relevant in a particular case, which should act first, and what exactly are the duties of particular agents, even when it seems clear that they have them. One of the largest and least tamed and understood creatures in this sea of agency are multinational corporations. Liberal traditional theory has traditionally had much more to say about the relations between individuals and the relations between individuals and governments and their respective responsibilities than about the relations of corporations to both individuals and to governments and their wider responsibilities to society and nature. The planetary influence exercised by multinational corporations counsels a reconsideration of priorities. In a landmark 2014 paper, Richard Heed showed that between 1854 and 2010, just 90 firms were responsible for 63% of all carbon and methane emissions. 83 of these firms are industrial producers of oil, natural gas, and coal, and 7 are cement manufacturers. Of these 90 firms, 50 are investor-owned, 31 are primarily state-owned, and 9 are entirely government-run. They are headquartered in 43 countries, 54 in industrialized countries, and 36 in developing countries. They extract resources everywhere in the world, and the energy and materials they produce are embodied in products that virtually everyone consumes. Almost all of these firms are still operative today, and their names are quite familiar. They include Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, Saudi Aramco, BP, Gazprom, Statoil, so on. More than half of these firms' emissions have occurred since 1988, and their emissions continue to rise each year. While these firms have different organizational cultures and behave in somewhat different ways, in many cases, they fund misinformation campaigns and pressure governments to allow them to continue business as usual. That is, when they are not already being run by the governments themselves. And these are possibilities that traditional liberal political theory seldom considered, since it tended to conceptualize business and corporations in contrast to government. Many of these firms are committed to using their power and market share to aggressively oppose or inhibit moving into a non-carbon future, thus devoting themselves to the unprecedented enterprise of trying to prevent humanity from adapting to potentially catastrophic environmental change. Multinational corporations often act in these ways, yet they also have the potential to act effectively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They have the financing and competence required to change their own practices, and they operate at a scale that can make a difference. But corporations that benefit from the existing system resist change, and governments that could level the playing field and change incentives themselves face the same collective action problems as corporations and individuals. NGOs and civil society can change corporate incentives by stigmatizing particular investments and behaviors and rewarding others. Yet all too often they too face strategic challenges when it comes to proactive mobilization, such as poor networking, lack of funding, and internal competition. In the Anthropocene, we have multiple agents operating at different levels of social organization with structurally enmeshed dynamics, facing problems at various levels and across levels. The result is that it is often just not clear who is responsible for doing what. For everyone, even the worst actors, there is often plausible deniability. This unsettled sea of agency is an expression of the systematicity of the forces that generate the problems of the Anthropocene. The manipulation of the carbon cycle is intrinsic to the global economy in the same way that driving a car or flipping a light switch are intrinsic to our daily lives. Carbon is mined in Australia, shipped to China, where it powers the manufacturing of cars, computers, and other products that are then exported to Europe and the United States. We drive to work, switch on our computers, and some of us write papers about the Anthropocene. Others do their versions of the same activities with the same results for the planet.